So in this lesson, I'm going to discuss how organisms create chemical energy to fuel their life processes. All organisms are going to need energy to survive. So in this lesson, we will talk about cellular respiration, which is the process by which organisms create ATP, a source of chemical energy that allows them to fuel all of their cell processes, including cell respiration itself, movement, growth, reproduction, etc. So the reason that we eat is to get energy, and the measure that we use to measure the amount of energy in our food is called a calorie. What exactly is a calorie? A calorie is the amount of energy that's stored in food. The energy is actually stored in the chemical bonds of the food molecules that you eat. Macromolecules that we learned about earlier this year, including amino acids, which you can see is the first macromolecule at the bottom there, glucose, which is the main source of energy, which is in the middle picture down there, and lipids, glycerol plus 3 fatty acid, all contain energy stored within their chemical bonds. But the main source of energy that we break down the main source of food that we break down for energy is carbohydrates. The process by which we break down glucose for energy is known as cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is going to start in the cytoplasm with the process of glycolysis. So in the picture on the right there, you can see that glucose is actually outside of the mitochondria, and it gets broken down in the first step called glycolysis. But the remainder of cell respiration is going to occur in the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, which is located inside of the mitochondria. You may remember when we talked about cells at the beginning of the year and their organelles, that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell because it carries out this process of cellular respiration. What types of organisms use this process? Well, of course, organisms with a mitochondria are going to use this process. So that includes both animal and plant cells. Things like fungi use cell respiration as well. But also bacteria. Bacteria do not have a mitochondria, but they have special membrane proteins that allow them to carry out cellular respiration to make the energy for their body. So in summary, both prokaryotes and eukaryotes are going to use the process of cellular respiration to create ATP. So the mitochondria structure is important for us to understand because you're going to be required to know where certain processes of cellular respiration are taking place. So you can see in the picture of the mitochondria here, the outside of the mitochondria is brown. The inner membrane, also known as the cristae, is a tan color. And the very interior portion of the mitochondria, which is blue in this picture, is actually the matrix. The matrix is somewhat similar to the stroma of the chloroplast because it's a fluid substance where certain reactions of cellular respiration take place. If you'd like to, you can watch this video. You'll just have to type in, you can watch this video. You'll just have to type in edpuzzle.com/content and it will take you to the video. So if we go back to look at the original essential question, how do organisms create chemical energy to fuel life processes? We can pretty much answer this in 2 words: cellular respiration. The breakdown of food is going to occur in little steps, in 3 major steps actually that we are going to learn about: glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and electron transport. But each one of those little steps is going to allow for energy to be created in a cell. Now the first 2 steps, glycolysis and Krebs cycle, as you can see on the right hand picture here, are only going to produce 2 ATP. However, the electron transport chain, which is the main event of cellular respiration, is going to produce 32 ATP, which is a lot of ATP from 1 glucose molecule that the cell can use for energy. So again, the overview of cell respiration occurs in 3 steps. Step 1 is glycolysis, which produces 2 ATP. Step 2 is the Krebs cycle, which also produces 2 ATP. And the last step of the cellular respiration process is the electron transport chain, which is step 3. And that produces most of the ATP, which is 32. So the basics of cellular respiration is that it's an aerobic process because it requires oxygen to occur. So when you're thinking of the word respiration, respiration means to breathe. We breathe in oxygen so that cellular respiration can be carried out. If we did not breathe in oxygen, many of you know that you would die, and that's because you can't do cellular respiration without oxygen. So if you cannot do cellular respiration, you cannot make energy to fuel your life processes. You can't keep your body alive without energy. So the reason that it's called cellular respiration is because we breathe in oxygen to keep the process going. So aerobic processes require oxygen. Cellular respiration is an aerobic process. Anaerobic processes do not require oxygen. So for example, glycolysis will get the breakdown of glucose started, but sometimes your cells do not have enough oxygen to actually run cellular respiration if they're being overtaxed. So a process called fermentation will occur, which is an anaerobic process because it does not require oxygen, but it still allows for energy to be produced. More on that later. I'm going to skip that. Okay, so for the overall chemical equation for cellular respiration, it's oxygen plus glucose yields carbon dioxide plus water plus energy. We breathe in oxygen again to take in for cellular respiration. You eat so that your body takes in glucose or other macromolecules that are in turn turned into glucose. And those two reactants are going to be used to undergo the process of cellular respiration. And it produces carbon dioxide, which you breathe out because it's a waste product in your body. It also produces water, and of course, cellular respiration is going to produce ATP, which is the most important thing about cellular respiration. It produces energy for our cells. The energy transformation that occurs in cellular respiration is chemical energy, which you guys already learned that glucose is a form of chemical energy because energy is stored in the chemical bonds of glucose. This energy in glucose is going to be transformed into chemical energy in the form of ATP. You guys also know that ATP stores chemical energy because you know that ATP has the high energy bond between the second and third phosphate of the ATP molecule. That when that bond is broken, that high energy bond is broken, the energy is released for the cell. So overall, the energy transformation in cell respiration is chemical energy in the form of glucose transformed into chemical energy in the form of ATP. So first we start with glycolysis here. At the beginning of glycolysis, we start with glucose as our main reactant. Glucose is going to be split in half into two 3-carbon compounds called pyruvic acid. In this picture, the black spheres represent carbon atoms in glucose. And you can see that the black spheres, you end up with 2 sets of 3 carbon atoms. So you end up with 2 pyruvic acid at the end of glycolysis. This first step breaks down the 6-carbon glucose, again, into 2 3-carbon pyruvate molecules. And this happens so that the rest of cellular respiration can be carried out. But the process of glycolysis actually happens in the cytoplasm, so this first step is actually outside of the mitochondria. But those pyruvic acid molecules, only if oxygen is present, will then be sent to the Krebs cycle to carry out the rest of cellular respiration. Glycolysis is said to be an energy investment step because you have to put 2 ATP into the process to get it started. So you can see at the top there on the top right with the red box, 2 ATP go in the process of glycolysis. And when that energy is released from ATP, 2 ADP molecules are going to come out. Now, in the second step of the conversion here for glycolysis, 4 ATP are going to be made at the end. So overall, net production of ATP in glycolysis will be 2 ATP total that are created because you had to spend 2 ATP to get 4 out. So if you're 2 down to begin with, when you get 4 out of the process, you end up with an overall net increase of 2 ATP from glycolysis. Also in this process, every time a conversion happens in a cell, then some electrons are going to be released and they need to be picked up. So much like in photosynthesis where we saw the energy carrier NADP plus picking up electrons, cellular respiration uses a molecule that's just a touch different. It uses the electron carrier NAD plus. So 2 NAD plus come in, they pick up electrons, and those 2 NAD plus, when they're carrying electrons, are known as NADH. And those NADH molecules, those electron energy carriers, are going to be sent to the electron transport chain only if oxygen is present to carry out a lot of ATP production. So in summary, glycolysis is the first step of cell respiration where glucose is broken down into 2 pyruvic acid molecules that will be sent to the Krebs cycle if oxygen is present. Glycolysis gives us 2 ATP. Glycolysis is an anaerobic process because it does not require oxygen. Glycolysis will always happen in your cells whether oxygen is present or not. So we always say that cell respiration in total is an aerobic process because the Krebs cycle will only run and the electron transport chain will only run if oxygen is present. But glycolysis itself is an anaerobic process. So in your notes, you should fill in the overall inputs, the reactants, and the outputs, the products, in the table that you have. The site of glycolysis is the cytoplasm. And if you look back to the diagram, you'll be able to count up the number of molecules that go into the process and the number of molecules that go out of the process. The two videos at the top there are actually posted on Canvas, so if you'd like to watch an overview of glycolysis in a YouTube video, you can go to either one of those links that are found on Canvas. Okay, so what are the inputs of glycolysis? The inputs are, check your answers, 2 ATP, 4 ADP, 2 NAD+, and 1 glucose molecule is going to go in as the input or the reactants of glycolysis. The outputs then are 2 ADP, 4 ATP, 2 NADH, and 2 pyruvic acid molecules. The question on the screen here says, what is the overall net production of ATP? Pause the video for a second, try to answer this question, and then restart the video. Okay, the overall net production of ATP is 2 ATP, because remember, you spent 2 ATP to get the process started, but you got 4 ATP out. The next question is, when oxygen is present, where do the pyruvate molecules go next? At this time, pause the video, attempt to answer this question, and then restart the video. Okay, so when oxygen is present, the pyruvate molecules or pyruvic acid molecules will go into the mitochondria so they can begin the Krebs cycle. If you'd like to, you can try some of these checkpoint questions, and I can check your answers for you. Okay, so now that oxygen is present in the cell, glycolysis has finished, 2 pyruvic acid molecules have been created, a little bit of ATP has been created, but we need to continue the process to make more ATP. So the Krebs cycle is what comes next. It's the second process of cellular respiration in which pyruvic acid, which is broken down into carbon dioxide, and ATP is produced. More importantly, though, you'll see that NADH and FADH2, both electron carriers, are going to be produced in this process, and they're going to be sent to the electron transport chain to make a major output of energy. Where does Krebs cycle occur? It occurs in the very interior of the mitochondria in the matrix. When you saw the picture of the mitochondria structure early on in the slides, that was the blue portion of the mitochondria. This is where the Krebs cycle is taking place. And again, the Krebs cycle will only take place if pyruvic acid enters the mitochondria when oxygen is present in the cell. If you'd like to watch this video, this link is also in the PowerPoint on Canvas, so you can probably take a look at this, and it's actually pretty good. It shows a summary of both glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. Okay, so this is the overall process of the Krebs cycle. It looks a little crazy right now, but we're going to go through it piece by piece so that you can understand. The Krebs cycle is going to start with 1 pyruvic acid molecule that came from glycolysis. So now pyruvic acid has entered the mitochondria, the process has started. Pyruvic acid is a 3-carbon compound. One of the carbons in pyruvic acid is released as carbon dioxide, so you end up with that 2-carbon compound called acetyl-CoA. So let's look at how many CO2 are actually produced in this process. You lose 1 carbon from pyruvic acid at the top there with CO2, boom. And then as the process continues, that acetyl-CoA, which is a 2-carbon compound, is going to enter the Krebs cycle and link with the 4-carbon compound that you can see at the bottom left of the screen. When you add a 2-carbon compound to a 4-carbon compound, you get the 6-carbon compound called citric acid. So you can see that there's 6 carbons. Now each time this citric acid molecule is converted into another compound, it loses a carbon dioxide. So citric acid is converted into a 5-carbon compound, a CO2 molecule is released, which makes sense because 6 minus 1 equals 5 carbons. A 5-carbon compound is then converted into a 4-carbon compound. Again, carbon dioxide is released. This is so important because the whole reason that you breathe out CO2 is because of the Krebs cycle in the matrix of your mitochondria. It's kind of weird to think about, but that's the case. Your mitochondria are releasing CO2, which you then in turn breathe out. Now, the whole reason that we go through these conversions, why? Well, that's to make NADH and FADH2 molecules, which are both energy electron carriers, and they're going to go to the electron transport chain to make a lot of ATP. So 3 CO2 are released, and again, that makes sense because there's 3 carbons in pyruvic acid. Each one of those carbons is released as a CO2. Let's look at how many NADH are produced. So the conversion of pyruvic acid to acetyl-CoA releases an NADH. You can see that at the top. And each subsequent conversion, so from citric acid to the 5-carbon compound, from the 5-carbon compound to the 4-carbon compound as we go around the Krebs cycle, And then the 4-carbon compound, again, as it's converted into citric acid, is going to also release an NADH molecule. So from one turn of the Krebs cycle, we release 4 NADH molecules. Okay, how many FADH2 are produced? There's one FADH2 that's produced, and I've highlighted this in purple as well as NADH because they have similar functions. FADH2 is also an electron carrier that's going to go to the electron transport chain to produce a whole lot of ATP. So just one FADH2 molecule is produced in one turn of the Krebs cycle. Finally, how many ATP are produced? You can see at the bottom left of the screen there that only one ATP is produced. That's highlighted in red there at the bottom of the screen. In one turn of the Krebs cycle, we only produce one ATP molecule. So where do NADH and FADH2 go after they pick up electrons from the Krebs cycle? Again, they're going to go to the electron transport chain. And the whole reason, again, that the Krebs cycle happens is to produce NADH and FADH2, which are going to make a lot of ATP at the electron transport chain. One more time, I'm going to say this again, you probably want to write it down, that the only reason the Krebs cycle happens, or the main reason the Krebs cycle happens, is that NADH and FADH2 are energy electron carriers that are going to carry those electrons to the electron transport chain to make ATP. So see, NADH, FADH2 to the ETC, they're going to go make lots of ATP. Okay, now, so the Krebs cycle is going to have to turn twice per glucose molecule because remember, in glycolysis, glucose is broken down into 2 pyruvic acid molecules. Each one of those pyruvic acid molecules has to enter the Krebs cycle separately. So because we have 2 pyruvic acid molecules coming from glycolysis, we must turn the Krebs cycle twice. So when we look at the amount of total products created per glucose, we have to multiply all of our one-turn products by 2 to get the total number of molecules coming out of the Krebs cycle per glucose molecule. So if we have 3 CO2 coming in from one turn of the Krebs cycle from the breakdown of 1 pyruvic acid, per glucose we're actually releasing 6 CO2 from the Krebs cycle. 4 NADH actually produces 8 NADH because we have to turn the Krebs cycle twice per glucose molecule. 2 FADH2 are going to be produced, and overall 2 ATP are produced. And you probably remember from the picture I showed you at the beginning of the overview of cellular respiration, and also from the overview slide, that in total the Krebs cycle produces 2 ATP. And that is because, again, the Krebs cycle must turn twice because each pyruvic acid coming from glycolysis will go through the process of the Krebs cycle. Okay, again, there's some more checkpoint questions here. If you want to pause the video and try them, you can, and I'll check your answers. Okay, the third and final step of the cellular respiration is the electron transport chain. This is the third step of cell respiration that's going to use all those high energy electrons that are carried down to the ETC by NADH and FADH2 to convert ADP into ATP on the electron transport chain. Where is the electron transport chain located? It's located in the inner mitochondrial membrane, or the cristae of the mitochondria. So when you look at the picture on the right there, where all those folds are in the mitochondria, that's the cristae. That's where the electron transport chain takes place. And the whole reason that the cristae is folded in that way is to increase the amount of area that's available for electron transport chain. So more folds equals more electron transport chain equals more ATP production. Okay, so the electron transport chain somewhat comes in 3 steps. The first step is that the high energy electrons carried by NADH and FADH2 are going to be passed along the inner mitochondrial membrane, also known as the cristae. Those electrons are going to be passed along to make ATP. So these high energy electrons provide the energy used to make ATP. The second thing that happens in the electron transport chain is that once the electrons have passed through the electron transport chain, they have to be picked up by someone for the final time. So the final electron molecule that accepts electrons, the final molecule that accepts electrons is oxygen. So this is huge. This is totally, totally important. The whole reason that you breathe in oxygen, the whole reason you need oxygen to stay alive is because of the electron transport chain and the electron transport chain only. And the reason for that is because oxygen must be present to pick up electrons at the end of the electron transport chain. This is also the reason that the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain will only occur when oxygen is present, because if you can't run the electron transport chain, if you can't pick up electrons at the end, then there's no point in sending pyruvic acid into the mitochondria. So pyruvic acid needs oxygen needs oxygen to enter the mitochondria so that Krebs cycle and electron transport chain can run. Okay, the final thing is that when oxygen picks up electrons, it becomes negative. So hydrogen ions, which are positive, are added to the oxygen to balance out those negative charges brought by the electrons. So when you add two H's to one oxygen molecule, then that makes H2O, which is, of course, water. So on your notes, you're going to want to fill in and highlight each one of these things that's happening on the electron transport chain. So first, you're going to want to highlight the first step that I just talked about, which is NADH and FADH2 dropping off electrons on the electron transport chain. You also want to make a note of how many NADH and FADH2 molecules are actually coming down here, so make sure you write that on as well. The second step, which corresponds with your notes, is that oxygen picks up electrons for the last time, so you can see that happening there. And then because oxygen becomes negative when it picks up those electrons, it's going to have to balance out with some positive hydrogen charge, which is when water is created, which is the final step of the electron transport chain. Now, you can also see on the right side of the picture here, the electrons being passed down the electron transport chain. Those are powering ATP, which is right here. ATP synthase makes ATP, and that's how the electron transport chain makes ATP, because NADH and FADH2 drop off their electrons, which are passed down the electron transport chain, and they are used to create the energy to make ATP here in the end. Okay, again, you can watch some of these videos to look at the overall process of cellular respiration. The links are on Canvas. Okay, so how many ATP are actually produced during cellular respiration? So during glycolysis, 2 ATP were produced. Now in Krebs cycle, 2 ATP were produced as well. But these NADH and FADH2 molecules that were created in both glycolysis and Krebs cycle are actually going to make more ATP than just straight up making ATP itself. So 1 NADH equals 3 ATP. 1 FADH2 equals 2 ATP. So to figure out the number of ATP made from the NADHs coming from glycolysis, we have to take this number, which is 2 NADH, and multiply it by 3, because each NADH makes 3 ATP. So that gives us a total of 6 ATP being made from the NADHs that were produced during glycolysis. Okay, this takes us to the Krebs cycle then. Of course, 2 ATP is directly going to make 2 ATP. But the 8 NAD, and it's supposed to have an H there, I apologize. The 8 NADH is coming from the Krebs cycle. Multiply that by 3, gives us 24 ATP being produced from those NADH molecules that came from Krebs cycle. Now finally, when FADH2 comes down and drops off electrons in the electron transport chain, it can actually make only 2 ATP. And the reason for this is because it drops its electrons off later in the ETC than NADH does. But the 2 ATP that are, the 2 FADH2 that are created here, we have to multiply this by 2 to get the total number of ATP created by the FADH molecules from Krebs cycle. So that gives us 4 ATP. So in total, if you add all these up, all the ATP produced from the 3 processes of cellular respiration, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain, gives us a total of about 38 ATP that are being produced from cellular respiration. But we don't actually get 38 ATP from cellular respiration, and here's why. If you look at this diagram here and you add up 2, 2, and 32, that gives you 36 ATP being produced by the process of cellular respiration. So why is it that only 36 ATP are created and not the 38 ATP that are possible? Well, it's because there's 2 ATP spent getting pyruvic acid into the mitochondria so that Krebs cycle and electron transport chain can occur. So if you have to spend those 2 ATP to get pyruvic acid actively transported into the mitochondria, then you have to take that from the overall total of ATP that are produced during cellular respiration. So the transport process that is used to get pyruvic acid in the mitochondria is active transport because it requires ATP. So we subtract that 2 ATP from the 38 possible ATP produced to give us a total of about 36 to 38 ATP being produced on the electron transport chain.